In January 2012, the Eastman Kodak Company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. This was not a small manufacturing firm succumbing to a slow quarter. This was the sudden collapse of American visual memory. At its peak, Kodak was a $20 billion monolith. It commanded a staggering 90% of the United States film market. It engineered the color chemistry that captured presidential assassinations and manufactured the specific high-contrast film that went to the moon. For a century, if an American held a photograph, they were holding a Kodak product. The paradox of their death is not that they were blinded by the past. The tragedy is that Kodak engineers literally invented the digital camera in 1975 and commercialized the first digital SLR in 1991. The empire was systematically dismantled by the exact electronic technology it created. Why did a monopoly so absolute allow its own invention to destroy it? The answer was never a failure of engineering. It was a failure of mathematics. Every week, we deconstruct the business models, the mechanical systems, and the market failures of the camera empires that taught the world how to see. Subscribe if the physical history of photography matters to you. The death of Kodak begins not with a bankruptcy, but in a third-floor workshop in 1880. Before the Eastman Kodak Company could monopolize visual memory, they had to solve a fundamental problem of physics and chemistry. In the 1870s, photography was not an act of casual observation. It was a hazardous, heavy, and frantic industrial process. The prevailing standard was the wet collodion process. To take a single photograph, an operator could not simply carry a camera. They had to carry an entire laboratory into the field. This required a massive, brass-lensed wooden view camera, a heavy wooden tripod, a portable darkroom tent, large sheets of fragile glass, and a suite of highly volatile chemicals. Inside the pitch-black tent, the photographer would coat a glass plate with collodion, a syrupy, highly flammable mixture of gun cotton dissolved in ether and alcohol. The plate was then plunged into a bath of silver nitrate to make it sensitive to light. The critical constraint was time. The wet plate had to be loaded into a light-tight holder, transferred to the camera, exposed, and developed before the ether evaporated and the emulsion dried. If the photographer miscalculated the exposure by a few seconds, or if the glass dried too quickly in the summer heat, the image was entirely lost. The physical friction of the medium meant that photography was strictly guarded by professionals, dedicated scientists, and wealthy aristocrats. It was impossible to separate the taking of the photograph from the making of it. In 1880, George Eastman, a 26-year-old bank clerk in Rochester, New York, sought to eliminate this friction. Eastman hated the cumbersome wet plate process. Following formulas published in British journals, he began cooking gelatin-based dry plate emulsions in his mother's kitchen. Dry plates were a massive technological leap. The glass could be coated with a stable, light-sensitive gelatin layer, dried, stored for months, and developed long after the exposure was made. The portable darkroom tent was finally obsolete. Eastman patented a mechanical plate coating machine and launched a successful dry plate manufacturing business. But he immediately realized that the fundamental bottleneck to mass adoption remained the glass itself. Glass plates were incredibly heavy. They shattered easily during transit across the country, and they had to be loaded into the camera one by one in absolute darkness. To build an empire, the physical substrate of the photograph had to change. It had to be flexible. It had to be continuous. It had to be rolled. In 1888, the first Kodak camera was released into the American market. Look closely at the physical object. It was not a complex optical instrument. It was a simple, unadorned, leather-covered wooden box measuring roughly 3 by 3 by 6 inches. It cost exactly $25, a significant sum for the era, but accessible to the upper middle class. It featured a rudimentary fixed focus lens and a string-set cylindrical shutter. There was no viewfinder. The operator simply pointed the wooden box in the general direction of their subject. But the true genius was hidden inside the dark chamber. The camera was preloaded at the factory with a roll of flexible paper-based stripping film, long enough to capture exactly 100 circular exposures. Eastman recognized that the general public would never buy into photography if they had to interact with silver halide chemistry. The marketing slogan he coined was arguably the most important in the history of consumer electronics. You press the button, we do the rest. When the customer finished firing their 100th exposure, they did not attempt to extract the film. They packed the entire wooden camera into a box and mailed it back to the factory in Rochester. For a $10 fee, Kodak factory technicians working under faint red safe lights opened the camera, extracted the paper roll, developed the negatives, stripped the emulsion from the paper base, printed 100 circular contact prints, reloaded the camera with a fresh roll of film, and shipped it all back to the consumer. In a single stroke, Kodak hid the terrifying chemistry of photography behind the brick walls of the Rochester factory. The mechanical system in the user's hands was reduced to a single button and a winding key. But the initial paper-based film had a fundamental physical flaw. During the stripping process in the laboratory, the texture of the paper grain often transferred onto the final prints, slightly degrading the clarity of the image. In 1889, Eastman solved this by replacing the fragile paper backing with clear, flexible celluloid. Look closely at a strip of early celluloid film. It was a continuous, transparent ribbon of plastic coated with a microscopic layer of light-sensitive emulsion. It could be wound tightly onto wooden spools, advancing mechanically behind the lens with the simple turn of an external knob. This single physical invention did not just refine still photography. It gave inventors like Thomas Edison the continuous, fast-moving medium required to invent the motion picture camera. The system was fully functional, but Eastman wanted absolute ubiquity. In 1900, the company released the Brownie. The physical object was almost shockingly primitive. It was a simple cardboard box camera wrapped in imitation leather, fitted with a basic meniscus lens. It cost exactly $1. A 6-exposure roll of film to feed it cost just 15 cents. The Brownie was marketed aggressively and directly to children. This was not merely a product launch. It was the creation of a generational habit. Kodak was teaching an entire society that capturing a moment should not be an industrial chore, but something cheap, casual, and universally accessible. The early retail reception was staggering. In its first year of production, over 150,000 Brownie cameras were sold across America. To meet demand, the factory in Rochester expanded, consuming entire city blocks, then sprawling across acres. By the 1920s, the company was manufacturing literal miles of film every single day. The distribution network stretched into every pharmacy, general store, and photo retailer in the country. You could not walk down a main street in the United States without seeing the iconic yellow and red Kodak sign projecting from a storefront, promising fresh film and guaranteed processing. Kodak had perfected a razor and blades business model decades before the term was taught in business schools. The cameras themselves were sold cheaply, often at a minimal margin, serving merely as mechanical vehicles. The true product, the financial lifeblood of the empire, was the chemical consumable. Every time a mechanical shutter fired, the customer owed Kodak money. Every time a roll was dropped off for development, Kodak profited on the processing chemicals. Every time a print was returned to a family, Kodak profited on the photographic paper. The camera had finally found its market. The market had not yet revealed its true scale. The Brownie camera secured the volume of the casual consumer, but absolute market dominance required capturing the truth of the world exactly as the human eye saw it. black and white film could record the geometry of a scene, but it could not record its emotion. Before 1935, color photography was an unstable, fragile, and often wildly inaccurate science. The early standard was the autochrome process, invented in France. It was a beautiful but frustrating medium. Autochrome relied on heavy glass plates coated with a layer of microscopic, dyed potato starch grains, acting as color filters. Because the dyed starch blocked a massive amount of light, the plates were incredibly slow. Taking a color photograph required mounting a heavy view camera on a sturdy tripod and asking the subject to hold perfectly still for several seconds. If the subject moved, the image blurred. If the glass plate dropped, the photograph shattered. It was entirely useless for capturing a moving modern world. Other early color systems required a photographer to take 3 separate sequential black and white exposures through 3 different heavy glass color filters, red, green, and blue, and then perfectly align them in printing. It was an optical chore. The breakthrough that transformed the Eastman Kodak Company from a successful manufacturer into an unassailable global monopoly did not come from traditional corporate engineers. It came from Leopold Manis and Leopold Godowski Jr., 2 professional musicians and amateur scientists working inside a Rochester laboratory. In 1935, they finalized the formula for a completely new 35mm color emulsion. They called it Kodachrome. To understand why this specific product defeated every rival on the market, you have to look at it under a microscope. Film, a continuous strip of acetate coated with light-sensitive chemistry, usually contained simple silver halide crystals that turned dark when exposed to light and developed. Kodachrome was an engineering miracle. It was a subtractive color reversal film. Slide film, film that produces a positive transparency, ready for projection, instead of a reverse negative for printing. A cross-section of a strip of 1935 Kodachrome revealed 3 distinct, microscopic layers of emulsion, stacked on top of a single celluloid base. Each separate layer was chemically tuned to be sensitive to a different primary color of light. The top layer recorded blue, the middle recorded green, and the bottom recorded red. But here was the physical genius that guaranteed Kodak's financial dominance. The unexposed film itself contained absolutely no color dyes. When you pulled a strip of Kodachrome out of its metal cassette, the emulsion looked milky and dull. It was, mechanically speaking, a highly complex black and white film. The brilliant colors were not captured, they were chemically injected. Because the color dyes were omitted from the raw film, the 3 emulsion layers could be manufactured incredibly thin. This meant that when light passed through the camera's lens and hit the film plane, it did not scatter or diffuse as it traveled through the layers. The physical result was an image of unparalleled optical sharpness, with a microscopic grain structure that competitors could not even approach. But this sharpness came with a heavy, deliberate, operational cost. The color dyes, cyan, magenta, and yellow, had to be added during a wildly complex chemical development sequence, known initially as K11 and later perfected as the K14 process. You could not develop Kodachrome in a tray in your basement darkroom. A standard 1-hour photo lab on a street corner could not process it. The K14 process required massive, continuous processing machines the size of train cars, highly trained industrial chemists, and chemical baths regulated to within a fraction of a single degree. Kodak turned this extreme complexity into a closed-loop financial system. For decades, when a customer bought a yellow box of Kodachrome at a pharmacy, the retail price quietly included the cost of the factory processing. The photographer shot the 36 exposures, placed the metal cassette into a heavy, prepaid yellow Kodak mailer envelope, and shipped it directly to a massive regional Kodak laboratory. Weeks later, the images returned in the mail, cut and mounted in small cardboard frames ready to be loaded into a projector. Rivals desperately tried to break this monopoly. In Germany, the chemical giant Agfa introduced Agfa Color. Agfa's engineers took a completely different approach. They embedded color couplers directly into the layers of the unexposed film itself. This meant Agfa Color could be developed through a much simpler chemical process that independent local photo labs could easily learn to handle. It was a more democratic system, but it lost the optical war. Because Agfa's film layers had to be thicker to hold the color couplers, the light scattered. Agfa Color could not match the extreme razor-edge sharpness of Kodachrome. Furthermore, the early Agfa dyes were unstable. They faded and shifted over time. Kodachrome was virtually indestructible if stored properly in the dark. By the post-war era, Kodachrome had become the absolute baseline for visual truth. When the technical reviewers at Popular Photography or Modern Photography magazines wanted to test the resolution of a brand new, expensive Japanese lens from Nikon or Canon, they did not use Japanese film. They loaded American Kodachrome because it was the only emulsion sharp enough to reveal the true limits of the glass. When a professional photojournalist working for National Geographic was sent on a 6-month assignment to the Himalayas or the deep Amazon, they packed hundreds of rolls of Kodachrome. They knew the physical film could survive brutal humidity and freezing altitudes, holding the latent image perfectly until it could be mailed back to the United States. Editors at Life magazine demanded it because the rich, deeply saturated reds and flawless skin tones translated beautifully to the mass-market printing press. Kodak was no longer just selling a chemical coating on a strip of plastic. They were selling permanence. They manufactured the film, they controlled the development machines, they manufactured the chemicals, and they built the carousel slide projectors that families used to display the results in their living rooms. The company had engineered a chemical monopoly disguised as a consumer product. The closed-loop system was perfected, and the market had completely surrendered. By the late 1970s, the Eastman Kodak Company had transcended the definition of a standard American manufacturing firm. It was no longer just a business. It was a sovereign industrial monolith built entirely on the manipulation of silver, light, and consumer habit. To comprehend the scale of this empire, you must look at the physical geography of Rochester, New York. The company's primary manufacturing hub, the Eastman Business Park, was effectively a city within a city. It covered over 1,200 acres of land. It possessed its own independent power grid, generating enough electricity to run a mid-sized American municipality. Because the production of photographic emulsions required absolute chemical purity, the factory operated its own water treatment facility, pulling 35 million gallons of fresh water a day from the depths of Lake Ontario, just to wash the acetate and silver halides. Inside the heavily guarded dark rooms of building after building, the physical creation of the film took place. Workers navigated vast, windowless production floors by touch or by the faint glow of dull red safe lights. They monitored massive, continuous spooling coating machines that ran 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. These machines applied microscopic layers of liquid silver gelatin onto endless miles of flexible celluloid base. A single dust particle could ruin 1,000 frames of film, so the environmental controls were stricter than those of modern surgical operating rooms. At its absolute peak, Kodak employed roughly 145,000 people globally, with tens of thousands walking through the Rochester gates every morning. This massive industrial engine fed an unparalleled retail distribution network. By 1976, Kodak held an almost unimaginable 90% of the film market and 85% of the camera market in the United States. If you opened a Sears or Kmart mail order catalog in 1980, Kodak cameras dominated the photography pages. If you walked into a professional retail giant like B&H Photo in New York City, The film counter was a towering, unbroken wall of yellow boxes. If you visited a local Walgreens pharmacy or a rural grocery store, a spinning wire rack near the cash register reliably offered 35mm rolls of Kodak Gold or Kodacolor. The brand was physically omnipresent. To guarantee that the massive coding machines in Rochester never stopped running, Kodak's engineers understood that they had to continually invent new physical formats to eliminate the friction of photography for the absolute beginner. While Kodachrome and standard 35mm film were the gold standards, loading a 35mm camera was still an intimidating mechanical process for a casual tourist. Traditional 35mm film, the familiar metal cassette with a protruding tongue of film, had to be carefully pulled across the back of the camera and manually threaded onto a rotating take-up spool. If the user failed to engage the sprocket holes correctly, the film would not advance. The photographer might shoot an entire vacation, winding the lever 36 times, only to realize later that the film had never moved and all the memories were lost to a blank roll. In 1963, Kodak permanently solved this anxiety by introducing the Instamatic camera series, utilizing the brand new 126 film format. The physical genius of the 126 cartridge was that it was a sealed, asymmetrical plastic box containing both the unexposed film and the take-up spool. It was completely foolproof. A consumer simply opened the back of the cheap plastic Instamatic camera, dropped the cartridge in. It only fit one way and snapped the door shut. There was no threading. There was no rewinding. When the roll was finished, you opened the back and handed the entire plastic block to the clerk at the drugstore. The original Instamatic was followed in 1972 by the Pocket Instamatic, which used the even smaller 110 drop-in film cartridge. Kodak sold these simple plastic cameras in the tens of millions. The retail price of the camera was practically irrelevant. Kodak was happily moving massive volumes of cheap hardware at razor-thin margins to achieve one singular goal: ensuring that millions of everyday Americans were continuously buying film cartridges, paying for chemical development, and ordering double prints. The ecosystem was flawless. The hardware drove the software, and the software was a consumable chemical. This mechanical and chemical dominance culminated in a cultural ubiquity that no modern technology company, not even Apple or Google, can truly claim in the physical realm. By the 1980s and into the 1990s, Kodak's annual revenues were climbing relentlessly toward the $20 billion mark. But the true scale of the empire was not felt in the Rochester boardrooms. It was felt at the retail service level. Consider the sensory environment of a typical American one-hour photo lab in 1995. The air was thick with the faint, metallic, slightly sweet scent of developer fluid and bleach fix. Dominating the back of the shop was a massive mini-lab machine, often manufactured by Noritsu or Fuji, costing upwards of $100,000 to install. The lab technician would crack open a customer's film cassette and tape the negative strip to a leader card. The film was then pulled continuously through the dark, internal roller transports of the machine, plunging into a precise timed sequence of Kodak C41 chemistry. First, the developer revealed the latent image. Next, the bleach halted the chemical reaction. Then, the fixer made the image permanent, followed by a final water wash. Minutes later, the dried negatives emerged and were optically projected onto giant rolls of Kodak photographic paper, which passed through its own chemical bath before dropping into a catch tray as glossy, vibrant 4x6 prints. Every single step of that process, occurring simultaneously in tens of thousands of independent labs, pharmacies, and supermarket kiosks across the country, generated direct revenue for Rochester. Kodak was the unquestioned baseline of visual truth for every tier of society. At the highest level of human endeavor, NASA engineers collaborated with Kodak to create the specific, ultra-thin, high-contrast emulsions used by the Apollo 11 astronauts to photograph the surface of the moon. In Hollywood, major motion picture studios relied overwhelmingly on Kodak vision stock to shoot blockbuster films. In the press rooms of the Associated Press and the offices of Time magazine, photojournalists covering wars and political campaigns pushed rolls of Kodak Tri-X black and white film to extreme ISO speeds, trusting the silver halide to capture the truth in terrible lighting conditions. In thousands of local wedding studios, professional portrait photographers staked their entire livelihoods on Kodak Portra, knowing the specific color dyes would render human skin tones with a warmth and physical depth that clients were willing to pay for. The cultural moment was not a single historical event, but a weekly ritual repeated in millions of American homes. When a family returned from a summer road trip, they dropped their film at the local lab. A few days later, they returned, paid the cashier, and eagerly opened a paper envelope. Consider the midpoint stakes of this massive, interconnected system. What would actually be lost if this physical object failed? If this film disappeared, America would not simply lose another brand of consumer goods on a drugstore shelf. It would lose the chemical language through which birthdays, wars, vacations, weddings, and ordinary afternoons became physical memory. In a family living room, the camera did not merely record memory, it decided which memories became physical enough to survive. The photo lab was the anchor of a town's visual history. The teenage lab technician, threading the film into the roller transport of the Noritsu machine, was physically handling the only existing copy of a child's first steps or a high school graduation. There was no digital cloud backup. There was no second chance, no recovered file, and no software undo button. Trust in the yellow box was absolute. Kodak had provided a standardized physical infrastructure for remembering the world. The company seemed utterly invincible. The film still worked perfectly. The global market was still expanding. But the brand looked strongest at the exact moment its weakness became structural. The long decline of the Eastman Kodak Company did not begin with a bankruptcy announcement, a sudden technological revolution, or the closing of a factory. It began with a small, brightly colored box appearing on American shelves. The first crack in the foundation appeared in 1984. The Olympic Games were held in Los Angeles, California. Kodak, operating under the structural arrogance of a total domestic monopoly, reportedly hesitated to pay the massive premium required to be the official photographic sponsor of the Games. They assumed that the American market belonged to them by default. Fujifilm, a Japanese chemical giant that had spent decades quietly and ruthlessly improving its own emulsions in the shadow of Rochester, seized the opportunity. Fuji paid the premium and won the sponsorship. Suddenly, American consumers, who had been taught from birth that film came exclusively in a yellow box, saw the bright green Fuji logo plastered across their television screens, stadium billboards, and trackside banners. Fujifilm was placed aggressively in local stores, often priced 10 to 20% cheaper than Kodak film. This was the arrival of the first major market force, price compression. Fuji's film was no longer a cheap, inferior substitute meant for toy cameras. Emulsions like Fuji Color Superia rivaled Kodak Gold in consumer sharpness, color reproduction, and exposure latitude. For the first time in a century, independent camera dealers, drugstores, and supermarket chains had a financial reason to stock an alternative. The local dealer slowly began allocating prime shelf space to the green box. Kodak responded the only way a monopoly could. They engaged in brutal price wars, which immediately ate into those sacred 70% profit margins. But Fuji was only a symptom of a much larger, quieter threat growing inside Kodak's own walls. The second terminal force was technology displacement. In 1975, a young Kodak electrical engineer named Steve Sasson had built a prototype device in a Rochester laboratory. The physical object was a chaotic assembly of circuit boards, a Super 8 movie camera lens, and 16 nickel-cadmium batteries. It weighed 8 pounds. It utilized a new solid-state component called a CCD sensor, a digital surface that recorded light electronically instead of relying on silver halide. It recorded a 0.01 megapixel black and white image onto a standard digital cassette tape. It took 23 seconds to expose the image, and another 23 seconds to read it off the tape onto a television screen. Sasson had invented the world's first self-contained digital camera. When he presented the 8-pound prototype to Kodak management, their reaction was not a failure of basic intelligence, but a failure of business model. The executives saw a device that produced a low-resolution, grainy image on a screen. But more terrifyingly, they saw a camera that completely bypassed the yellow box. It did not use film, it did not require liquid development chemicals, and it did not produce photographic paper prints. The internal math of Rochester was paralyzed by a syndrome known as margin protection. A physical roll of 35mm film cost cents to manufacture but sold for dollars, generating an astonishing profit margin. The consumer then paid again for the paper and chemicals to print it. How do you convince a board of directors to willingly abandon a high-margin chemical consumable business for a low-margin consumer electronics business, where you only sell the hardware device once? Kodak did not ignore digital technology. In fact, they invested billions of dollars into sensor research throughout the 1980s. But their entire strategy was defensive. They wanted to use digital technology to encourage more printing. In 1991, they released the Kodak DCS, or Digital Camera System, the world's first commercially available digital SLR. Look at the physical object. It was a 1.3 megapixel Kodak digital, back-bolted onto a heavily modified mechanical Nikon F3 camera body. Because memory cards did not yet exist, the camera was tethered by a thick, heavy cable to a separate digital storage unit, a hard drive and battery pack that the photographer had to wear over their shoulder on a strap. The system cost roughly $20,000. It was a highly specialized tool strictly for press photojournalists who needed to transmit images over phone lines to meet newspaper deadlines. It was not meant for the masses. It was a proof of concept, but it lacked the frictionless convenience required to change global behavior. Instead of cannibalizing their own film sales with cheap digital cameras for the public, Kodak made one final, desperate billion-dollar mechanical bet to save the chemical ecosystem. In 1996, in a massive consortium with Canon, Nikon, Minolta, and Fuji, Kodak launched the Advanced Photo System, universally known as APS. Kodak branded their version of the film Advantix. It was a completely new physical film format designed to fix every lingering complaint about 35mm photography. The Advantix cartridge was smaller and fully enclosed. There was no film leader to thread. It offered true drop-in loading. The cartridge communicated magnetically with the camera, allowing the user to shoot 3 different aspect ratios: classic, high definition, and panoramic, on the exact same roll of film. Kodak spent over $1 billion developing the system and forced photo labs across the country to buy entirely new, highly expensive processing equipment to handle the magnetic data strips on the negatives. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The physical negative was 30% smaller than traditional 35mm film, meaning the optical image quality was noticeably worse, suffering from prominent grain when enlarged. But more importantly, the timing was fatal. Just as Kodak was trying to convince consumers to buy a completely new type of mechanical film camera, the digital sensor was improving at an exponential rate, driven by Moore's law. Sensor resolution doubled. Processing speeds increased. Retail prices plummeted. By the early 2000s, the market forces violently converged. Consumers began abandoning both 35mm and APS film entirely for digital point-and-shoot cameras. A consumer bought a digital camera once. They never had to buy a roll of film again. They never had to pay $10 for chemical processing. They shared the images instantly on computer monitors. This triggered the third and most devastating force: the collapse of the service and retail ecosystem. The photo lab network began to die, and it died because of the strict rules of chemistry. A Noritsu or Fuji Minilab machine required constant daily volume to keep the C41 developer and bleach fix active and stable. If the machine did not run enough film, the chemicals oxidized, went bad, and ruined the negatives. As digital cameras stole the volume, independent camera stores, grocery chains, and local pharmacies could no longer justify the maintenance contracts, the chemical disposal costs, and the labor required to keep the processors running. This led directly to the fourth force: cultural habit collapse. When a town lost its one-hour photo lab, shooting film became deeply inconvenient. The photographer had to mail the film away and wait weeks. The friction that George Eastman had eliminated in 1888 returned. The ecosystem broke. In 2001, film sales peaked worldwide. From that exact point, the drop was not a gentle slope. It was a cliff. The human consequence was staggering. Between 2003 and 2011, Kodak eliminated over 47,000 jobs. The massive factories in Rochester became hollowed-out ghost towns. Vast manufacturing buildings were literally imploded with dynamite because it was cheaper for the company to destroy them than to pay local property taxes on the empty floor space. The company tried desperately to pivot to digital consumer cameras, launching the EasyShare line. For a brief moment, they held significant digital market share in the United States. But the digital hardware was a low-margin commodity. There was no chemical monopoly to protect the profits. Asian electronics giants like Sony, Panasonic, and Samsung, companies that didn't have to protect legacy film businesses, drove hardware prices into the ground. Then came the smartphone, making the dedicated digital compact camera feel entirely redundant. The final exit was not a single moment, but a painful, systematic shedding of assets. Kodak sold its health imaging division. It sold its highly advanced sensor manufacturing division. In 2009, Kodak officially ceased production of Kodachrome, the film that had defined the 20th century. The wildly complex K14 chemicals were no longer manufactured. The end of the chemical era arrived in December 2010. Dwayne's Photo, a family-owned lab in Parsons, Kansas, was the very last facility on Earth still operating a Kodachrome, continuous processing machine. Photographers from all over the world mailed in their final hoarded yellow boxes. When the last roll was pushed through the roller transport, the highly toxic K14 chemistry was drained from the massive tanks forever. The film could never be developed again. The catalog changed. The dealers stopped ordering, the mini-labs vanished, the chemical baths were drained, the massive coating machines slowed, the patents were sold, the yellow boxes disappeared from the shelves. The brand remained, the market moved on. When the Eastman Kodak Company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in 2012, it seemed the story of American chemical photography was definitively over. The media wrote the obituaries. The corporation that emerged from the court proceedings in 2013 was drastically smaller, a shadow of its former self, pivoting to focus primarily on commercial printing, packaging, and industrial chemicals. But the death of Kodak's corporate monopoly was not the death of its physical objects. Today, the legacy of Kodak film does not exist merely as nostalgia. It exists as a deliberate, expensive, and mechanical choice by a modern generation of creators who actively reject the frictionless, disposable perfection of digital sensors. Go to a dedicated used camera store in Chicago, London, or Tokyo today, and you will find a thriving, highly competitive collector and user market for analog equipment. Mechanical 35mm SLRs and medium format cameras that were practically given away in 2010 are now selling for hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars. The repair benches that survived the digital purge are now backed up for months, servicing metal shutters and brass gears for a new generation. But those mechanical cameras are essentially useless without a steady supply of chemical film to feed them. Kodak Alaris, a separate corporate entity formed during the British pension settlement of the bankruptcy, continues to manage and distribute Kodak-branded personalized imaging products and photographic film. In Rochester, the massive Eastman Business Park still operates, albeit on a fraction of its original 1,200-acre footprint. Deep inside Building 38, the giant continuous spooling coating machines are remarkably running again. In the late 2000s and early 2020s, a massive resurgence in analog photography caught the global industry completely by surprise. Kodak found itself struggling not with a lack of demand, but with severe supply chain shortages. They had to frantically hire and train a new generation of chemical technicians to replace the master engineers who had already retired. This is not nostalgia. It is chemistry. At the absolute highest levels of the motion picture industry, modern directors like Christopher Nolan, Quentin Tarantino, and Paul Thomas Anderson actively lobbied the major Hollywood studios to sign long-term contracts guaranteeing the continuous purchase of millions of feet of Kodak Vision 3 motion picture film. They demanded the physical medium because the chaotic, organic grain structure, the massive dynamic range, and the specific, gentle highlight roll-off of chemical film cannot be truly duplicated by a digital sensor, no matter how much software manipulation is applied in post-production. In the consumer and professional still market, a massive wave of contemporary photographers completely relies on Kodak Portra 400 for high-end wedding and portrait photography. They pay the premium price for the physical rolls and the subsequent lab fees because the unique chemical emulsion renders human skin tones with a warmth, color depth, and physical dimensionality that digital raw files simply struggle to match. The physical site in Rochester stands today as a quiet monument to both American industrial might and the ruthless speed of technological displacement. The dedicated power plant still hums. The surviving darkroom buildings still carefully coat the acetate. But the ultimate inescapable irony of the Kodak empire is a matter of archival stability. The digital photograph, the exact, frictionless technology that Steve Sasson invented in 1975, and the market forces used to destroy Kodak's business model is fundamentally fragile. Billions of digital images are permanently lost every single year to corrupted hard drives, forgotten cloud passwords, decaying servers, and obsolete file formats. Digital memory requires constant active electricity and format migration just to survive. Yet in millions of attics, basements, and archives across the world, the physical, chemical negatives that Kodak manufactured 50 years ago remain perfectly stable. They require no batteries, no operating system updates, and no subscription fees. They are completely silent, waiting only for physical light to reveal them again. In a dark room in Brooklyn, a young photographer stands under a dull red safe light, surrounded by the faint, metallic scent of developer fluid. A strip of Kodak Tri-X negative film, manufactured in Rochester, exposed inside a heavy mechanical camera, and developed by hand in liquid chemistry, is carefully placed into the metal negative carrier of an enlarger. The switch is thrown. The enlarger bulb ignites. The light cuts directly through the suspended silver halide crystals, projecting the dormant image onto the baseboard below, proving that while the corporate monopoly finally collapsed, the physical agreement between light and chemistry remains entirely unbroken. See you in the next one.